So the book The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood has become kind of the pro-choice mantra lately. After Roe versus Wade was passed, even Margaret Atwood said that she feels like it's getting closer to the reality of what she wrote about. Now, as I read through it and as I read some of the history of the book itself, I have actually become convinced that I don't think it's quite as pro choice. In fact, I would say it might even be seen as pro life in some ways, and even not being so anti Christian as people always think. Let's get into that. I know this is kind of an odd thing for me to get into. It's not something that I generally talk about, but I want to do probably more book reviews on my channel. So, this is something that I found pretty interesting as I was just getting into this book and realizing this isn't quite as anti Christian or anti pro life as I really expected it to be. And in fact, there's some things in there that I think show some kind of nuggets of truth. I think this is the sort of thing that is the reason why I would say, as Christians, we should never look at any book as a banned book. Any book should be something, even for younger kids getting ready to go off into college, that we should encourage them to read and teach them how to think critically as they read through it. Now, a little bit of background that's interesting about Handmaid's Tale. When I started to read the book, actually, until I even finished the book and did a little bit more research on Margaret Atwood and the book itself, I had thought that this was kind of a book that was written as this dystopia from the perspective of, if we make abortion illegal, this is eventually where we're going to end up, because that's how this is talked about. That a lot of times people are saying, now that Roe versus Wade has been overturned, we're going to end up in the Handmaid's Tale, which is obviously ridiculous. But what's interesting is looking at the history. This book was written in 1985. A movie was made of it in 1990, and when it was actually published was shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and a lot of the people there actually saw that as a really great commentary to their experiences for those who were living in East Berlin. So this was actually much more, when you talk to Margaret Atwood or listen to some interviews, the idea of this book was twofold. Is answering the question of, if America had a totalitarian government, what would that look like? And she kind of looked at the Puritan fathers of of America and said, I think maybe this is the direction things could end up going. And then the second question was, religious right saying that women should be at home is a movement that she was seeing happen in the mid 80s, and thought, all right, if that's the view of this kind of religious right, then how would that actually come about? And part of her thoughts were, well, you could get them back home, women back home, by just taking away their money, take away their credit cards, kind of imagining a world where cash doesn't even exist at all, and just you would take all the money from any woman and give it to either her husband or her father. And that's kind of the groundwork of how this dystopian future actually comes about in Handmaid's Tale. So that's what this is kind of getting at. It's not actually supposed to be this commentary like it's often pitched as a commentary on what will it be like if we no longer have the rights to have an abortion in America, and what eventually would happen. That wasn't the meaning behind it. The focus wasn't on abortion at all. The focus was more on controlling women, saying that women need to be stay at home and that sort of thing. That's more of what sparked her reason to write. Now, all of that being said, I'm not saying that I endorse this book. I'm not saying that I love everything about it. There's a lot of not good things in it. But I think one of the things that good writing has some little nuggets of just like a good author, I think at times has some ways that they kind of acknowledge and understand the human mind and psyche and explain it in some way or another through story. Story is really engaging. This is something that I'm hoping to engage more with as I kind of continue my career in apologetics, of how can I now express apologetics and the truth of Christianity through story, or engaging with the stories of others, hence why doing this book review, rather than just here's the facts. So I'm going to read you some different quotes that I found interesting and kind of talk about this. There's a couple of things that are interesting truths that I think this brings out that actually supports more of a Christian worldview. For the first quote, one of the things that's interesting is the the main character who I think ends up being kind of named, or she's positioned as an Ophryd, I think is what it's called. She says this at one point, knowing that, so to give you even a little bit more background, essentially what Handmaid's Tale is saying is that eventually it would get to a point that some women are employed to essentially, not employed even, they become almost sex slaves. They're there to produce offspring for higher ups within the society, and that's all they do. And then their own children are raised by that father and the wife, regardless of the status. The woman doesn't even have any status. She's a baby maker. That's it. But with that, there's these red dresses and white hats that the women who are these women that are, they're just women to produce offspring, are supposed to wear to keep them not seen as prizes, not seen as sexual lusts, to keep them chaste, and then to keep them from looking at other people. Hence, they have these hats that are kind of blocking their view, that to look anywhere but forward. But one of the things that she says, the main character says at one point, she says, women weren't protected then. Now we walk along the same street in red pairs, and no man shouts obscenities at us, speaks to us, touches us. No one whistles. And this is something that I think from any perspective, most people are looking at this and saying, that's good. Like, I don't think anyone looks at the times that a woman gets catcalled, has obscenities said to them as they're just walking along the street, and says, that's a good thing. We would say that's a bad thing. That needs to stop. Men, do better. An interesting thing in this is how this seems to be really like one way. There's a double standard right now in our society about this, that like a woman can catcall and it's a joke, or it's funny, or it's entertainment. But if a guy does that, which he shouldn't, that's wrong. So I even saw a video today that literally this girl records herself just seeing a guy who's walking along the street, minding his own business. He does have his shirt off, and she just walks up to him and says, hey, can I get a 360? And he's like, what do you mean? Like, a 360? Can you just spin around for me? If a guy ever said that to a girl, that would be seen as obscene. It would be seen as catcalling. It would be wrong. But instead, in this video, because he's not used to experiencing that, sees it more as a compliment. Whether or not he should is a whole nother question. He just asks her out, and it's seen as fine. That's a double standard, and that's something that should change. And regardless, though, all of that to say, here's a point that I think we can agree with. If we could get to a society that was set, that men no longer catcalled women, that would be a good thing. And I would argue that women don't go catcalling men. That we shouldn't just alternate that. We shouldn't now have, well, men don't do it, but girls do it. That's not an improvement. And that's something that I think the Christian worldview gets behind. In the end, when Christ says, do not look at a woman with lust, to do so is like committing adultery in your own heart, I think the same can be said of saying things in lust. That would be wrong as well. So that's a great point that I think was great. Another thing is, there's another quote that says, no one dies from lack of sex. It's lack of love that we die from. Now that one's really interesting to me, because so much of the abortion movement is this kind of idea that like, I should be able to have sex freely and whenever I want. And sometimes when that happens, even if I'm doing it with protection, sometimes I get pregnant, and I shouldn't have to deal with the consequences of that, because I must be able to have sex. That's a life requirement in some sense. And that's just not true. And Margaret Atwood points that out. No one dies from lack of sex. It's lack of love. And sex is not love. It's not the same thing. And that's something that we sometimes forget. I don't think society is necessarily promoting the idea that sex equals love. But love is what we need. Community is what we need. And oftentimes, I think possibly with people who do end up being sex obsessed that are sleeping around a lot, it might be because they don't really have real relationship. And that's the best that they can find, is that sort of thing. Another interesting quote was said actually by the main character's mother, and she's kind of an interesting character in this story in the sense that, like, she seems to be kind of following, is almost the spokesperson of feminism today. The way she talks seems to honestly somewhat fit. I don't know if necessarily this is what she was going with in this character. And I'm not sure if she's even writing to like see her as a hero within the story. Part of, I think, writing is oftentimes writing a character that is a little gray. And there's some aspects that you seem to respect her mother as someone that's fighting against this change into this oligarchy that kind of happens. And that's a good thing. But then there's other things that she says that I don't think are necessarily supposed to be seen as good. But this is one of the things that she says. Anyway, what do I need it for? I don't want a man around. What are they except for 10 seconds worth of half babies? A man is just woman's strategy for making other women. That in itself is really interesting to me, because if this is supposed to be the person that in some ways her and maybe one other character seem to be the ones that are supposed to really emphasize being against Gilead, which is the system that this dystopian system that exists, where women are used as baby makers. At the same time, here's the person that's rebelling against that, that's supposed to in some sense be the hero and against all of the horribleness of this new government. And yet she was doing the very same thing to men. She was saying, what good are they except for 10 seconds worth of half babies? It's just women's strategy for making more women, which now this dystopian government is using women to make more men. It's the same thing. It's the same problem. So there has to be something in the middle, and I would suggest biblical marriage, that actually fixes this, because either extreme seems questionable. Either extreme seems bad. She goes on and she says, he wasn't up for fatherhood, talking about the main character's father. As the mother keeps talking, she says, not that I expected that of him. Just do the job, then bugger off, I said. I make a decent salary and I can afford daycare. And at that, again, the man is seen as just a baby maker. He is needed in order to produce offspring, and he's not needed for anything beyond that. And you wonder why, okay, women are like often struggling as single women to raise up children on their own. And I will be the first to say that should not happen. It should not be happening. We should fight against that. We need to enforce even laws to make sure that a father takes care of his offspring, whether he wants to be in their lives or not. There should be legal requirements that at the very least he has to take care of the children financially, but even more so beyond that, because if a father isn't involved, we see that that's probably actually arguably the number one indicator of someone living a life of crime later in life, is that they don't have a father figure who's around and involved with their life. So fathers, we need to be around. But you have to ask if, as I would say, this mother in this story is kind of speaking to what feminists are saying now. The feminists that are reading this book and saying, if we make abortion illegal, we're going to end up in Handmaid's Tale. If this is what they're saying, then why are we surprised that men don't stick around to take care of the children? Because they're seen as baby makers. They're just seen as part of the formula to get offspring. And also this idea that like, well, I do well enough as a single woman that I can take care of the children and send them off to daycare. Is that really like what you desire? And maybe I know there's plenty of women out there that are very like career driven, and I'm not saying that's bad. I'm not saying you should want to stay home. I honestly don't believe that. But if you want to, you should be able to. That's the idea, though, that you're saying men are just there to help you make offspring is the reason why some of these women who would like to be able to stay home and take care of their children are not able to, because a father won't stick around if you've only seen as a way and a means to attain children. So, another quote, at one point, she says this, "But if you happen to be a man sometime in the future and you've made it this far, please remember, you will never be subject to the temptation or feeling you must forgive, a man as a woman. It's difficult to resist, believe me, but remember that forgiveness too is a power. To beg for it is a power. To withhold it or bestow it is a power, perhaps the greatest." Now, she's right. I won't ever know as a man what it's like to forgive a woman. And I will say that men have done more to hurt, to damage, to otherwise hold women back than women have done to men. But let's also make sure that we don't end up going the other direction and making it so now we're pressing down men, that we're degrading men, that we're ignoring the problems of men, that men have such a mental crisis right now that suicide is rampant within the male race. And so those sort of things are things that, yes, we haven't experienced the pain that men have brought on women as men. But that doesn't mean that we haven't experienced pain. It doesn't mean that we don't have things that we also need to forgive. And she's right. There is power in that, but also withholding forgiveness doesn't ever help you. And that's not saying that those people are worthy of forgiveness, but that's part of the thing of being Christ followers is we don't wait for someone to be worthy of forgiveness, because we aren't. We weren't. We aren't. We won't be. But Christ forgave us. And so because of that, we follow in action. Here's another quote, and I probably should have just paired this with the other one from the mother. One of the other characters in this story, if I'm remembering correct, Aunt Lydia is the character that, so in the household that the main character is in, she is there as the baby maker. Once she has the child, then another woman will be there to take care of the child. Yet the child will be seen as another woman who is actually the wife of the commander of that household. That's going to be viewed as her child, even though she didn't birth it, nor will she be the one that's taking care of it. And so the woman that's taking care of it says, "Men are sex machines," said Aunt Lydia, "and not much more. They only want one thing. You must learn to manipulate them for your own good. Lead them around by the nose. That is a metaphor. It's nature's way. It's God's device. It's the way things are." And again, I have to point out the irony here of here's another woman who's kind of pushing in some sense against the system, but she's once again putting men in this quality of they're just there to produce offspring. Use them for that. And if they're not there for offspring even, you can withhold sex in order to get them to do whatever you want. That wouldn't be good if a guy did it. It shouldn't be good if a girl does it. Going on, there's one moment in the story that Luke, who is her husband, before all of this happens, at the beginning of this all happening, she gets fired from her job. All the women get fired from their job, and all of their money is taken out of their bank accounts and given to their husbands or to their fathers. And as she's talking this through with her husband, he's doing what he can to understand, to be there for her. And he says this, he says, "Hush," he said. He was still kneeling on the floor. "You know, I'll always take care of you." I thought, already, he's starting to patronize me. Then I thought, already, you're starting to get paranoid. And I love this part. I thought was interesting because it showed I couldn't blame, if this situation were ever to happen, I wouldn't blame a woman for at that point feeling like, for a split second, you're patronizing me. I've just lost my job. I'm never going to get it back. And I've lost all of my money. And you're saying, I'll take care of you. And I can understand that. I can understand the thought of like, you're patronizing me. But I love that still in this, she also says, already you're starting to get paranoid. She's that self-talk of realizing like, hey, he's saying he'll take care of you. He's not doing that to patronize you. He's doing that because he cares. He's having compassion. He's trying to be there for you. And that's something that I think I would say that these third wave feminists might want to keep in mind, that sometimes that when a guy holds the door open, I haven't experienced this, but sometimes I've heard many stories of guys who hold open a door for a girl and their reaction is, you're patronizing me because you're acting as if I can't hold the door myself. I hold the door open for women. I hold the door open for old people. And oftentimes when I'm just walking up, even if a young guy is walking up at the same time as me, I'm just going to hold open the door. It has nothing to do with thinking that you're unable. I'm doing it to honor you. I'm doing it to serve you. That's what Christ is calling us to do. And oftentimes, some of the things that a guy might say by these extreme feminists are seen as patronizing, and that's just not the case. And I like the bit of humanity in this, that she recognizes that you might have that little thought for a split second, and that's okay. I think oftentimes any of us might have a moment of like, you're doing this for me because you don't think I can do it myself. And then realizing, no, they're just being nice. And that's really all it is. Going on, he also tries to kind of comfort, and he says, we still have, he said. But he didn't go on to say what we still had. It occurred to me that he shouldn't be saying we, since nothing that I knew of had been taken from him. And again, maybe this is one of those moments that like, it's a hard time. This would be a tough situation. And I understand, again, I think the level that she might think in that moment. Nothing's been taken from you, but I think what he probably was going to try to express is like, we still have each other. We can get through this. This is a hard thing for you, but as a part of this marriage, I'm going to step through this with you, just as I would in any situation. If it turns out that my wife came down with cancer, then what my reaction should be is, we still have each other. I'll walk through this with you, even though I'm not the one that has cancer. And so just giving each other grace in those hard times, I think, is important. Now, this is probably the most interesting quote that I found in the book. At one point, Luke and the main character are running away, trying to get away before things really get to the extreme that it ends up in. And they realize if they leave, they can't take the cat with them, because if they say, we're just going to the beach for a day, everyone's going to be like, you're not just taking a cat to the beach, you're running away. But they also can't leave it because the cat will start wandering around and people will start asking questions. And so they decide, we have to kill the cat. And there's this moment that Luke, he says, I'll take care of it. And because he said it instead of her, I knew it meant kill. That is what you have to do before you kill, I thought. You have to create an it where none was before. That's one of the things they do. They force you to kill within yourself. That to me was fascinating couple of lines, because when we talk about abortion, here's this book that is being seen as the pro-choice agenda and kind of showing how horrible things would become if we outlawed abortions in all cases. Yet it acknowledges in this book, in order to kill something, you have to make it, instead of a her, instead of a he, instead of a actual thing that we believe has a right to life, you have to say it. And that's exactly what the pro-choices community has done and has to do in order to justify abortion being okay in any circumstance. Whether it's the circumstance of a woman who's 9 months pregnant and decides, I want to kill this child because I wanted a boy and I realize it's a girl. You have to say it's an it. Or even in the horrible circumstances of when someone is pregnant because of rape or incest, something like that, we would never say it is okay to kill a her or a he, even if it's the result of something like that, if it is a her or a he. But if I make sure that that's an it, it's just a bunch of shells. It is just a bunch of cells. It is just a blob. It is not conscious. It does not feel pain. Then I can kill it. But if it's a he, if it's a her, if it's alive, if it's in some way human, if it's in some way something that we would say has human rights, as we look, even in this story, it's talking about killing a cat, and we think of how the Humane Society would object to any of those sort of things, we wouldn't say it's justified. So, and another quote that a couple more quotes that I liked. That was part of it. The sex was too easy. And this is the commander at this point talking. Anyone could just buy it. There was nothing to work for, nothing to fight for. We have the stats from that time. You know what they were complaining about the most? Inability to feel. Men were turning off on sex. Men were turning off on sex even. They were turning off on marriage. This is an interesting thing of like realizing like when you make something so readily available, then all of a sudden it has no value. And our society has looked at it and said, you can have sex anytime with anyone for any reason, and it's okay. And at that point, now sex has no value. That some of what marriage ends up being is waiting until you're married in order to have sex. Why would I bother? Why would I bother getting married? Because I can get all of the benefits of marriage without any of the responsibilities of it before I get married. So why would I bother? That there's some extent, and I'm not saying it all because I think this absolutely goes both ways. As a guy, I desire a meaningful relationship with a woman someday that will be dedicated to each other. And I realize if I decide I'm just going to allow us to indulge in our sexual desires before, then in some ways I've cheapened my own value to her. Because now I'm saying you can have all the benefits of sexual relationships with me. You can have all the benefits of marriage with me without the commitment of it. This goes both ways, but in times in the past, women have been the gatekeeper of this, where men oftentimes would want and push for sex outside of marriage, and women often, not always, would hold back on that. I'm not saying it's women's responsibility. It's both people's responsibility. But if you want to be valued and you give that value freely, then of course, you have in some sense given a value away. Now, that at any point can be brought back. I'm not saying at all if you're one of those people that has had sex before you get married, that now you are valueless. You have less value. That's not what I mean. That's what Christ's redemption is that you are a new creation. The old has gone, the new has come. In God's eyes, and therefore it doesn't matter what anyone else sees, you are pure, you are holy. And so you are valuable. And to withhold that now, to not give the fruits of marriage to someone before they have engaged in the commitment of it, that's worth waiting for. Another thing the commander ends up saying is nature demands variety for men. It stands to reason. It's part of the procreational strategy. It's nature's plan. I don't say anything. So he goes on. Women know that instinctively. Why do they buy so many different clothes in the old days? To trick men into thinking they were several different women, a new one each day. This is a quote that I can understand why someone comes to this conclusion, but I think the science is actually against this. Because there's some level that with things like pornography, we have trained ourselves to look for the nuances, look for something different all of the time. And if you don't get that stimulation, you look for something else. And that's why a guy addicted to porn will look at a picture of a girl with this body type in one moment and another girl with a totally different body type in the next. And it makes it an impossibility that any woman can ever reach the beauty that this man is imagining in his own mind. Now, in some sense, that's what I think people look at to say something like this, to think it's part of nature to demand and want variety. But it's only there because we've created this whole porn industry. We've created this thing of you can have sex whenever you want, with whoever you want, for whatever reason you want. But that changes when you have dedicated marriages. Because the science of it is your brain is programmed that when you achieve orgasm, you are going to connect with whatever you are beholding in that moment. And so if you decide you wait till marriage to have that pleasure, then you are going to program your mind to always think of, when you have sexual excitement, to think of that person. And so you program your brain, this neural pathway, to think of that person, think of that person, think of that person, think of that person, anytime you have sexual arousal. And so nature isn't programmed for variety. Nature ends up being programmed for what you feed it. And if it ends up being variety, to some extent that might be true. But you can change that, even if you are someone who's struggled with that. I've struggled with that. That you can reprogram your brain to desire your wife, your spouse. And nature will then demand not variety, but your spouse. So nature isn't that way. So those are my thoughts from the book. I know this was kind of a different thing, but I'm hoping to kind of read stories like this and break it down a little bit and throw it out to you in the future. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll catch you next week.